At exactly 11:42 on a cold Friday morning, Caleb Mercer sat in a quiet conference room and listened as his grandfather's estate was divided among the members of the Mercer family. The room was filled with expensive suits, polished shoes, legal folders, and people who had spent most of their lives measuring success by numbers. Caleb had always felt like the odd one out in that room. His grandfather, Everett Mercer, had built a massive construction and property empire from almost nothing and had become one of the wealthiest men in the state. Everyone expected the inheritance hearing to be the final celebration of his success. Caleb expected something different. He had never been close to the family business, and he had never fought for a place inside it. While his older brother Julian had spent years learning the company's finances, Caleb had chosen a quieter life. He worked with his hands, repaired old machines, and lived in a modest house away from the family estate. When the estate lawyer, Evelyn Hart, began reading the will, Caleb listened without much expectation. His father, Martin Mercer, received a large investment portfolio and several valuable financial accounts. Julian received 3 luxury properties, a substantial trust, and shares in several companies. Other relatives received stocks, cash, land, and business interests. Every few minutes, someone smiled, whispered, or leaned toward another family member with satisfaction. Then Evelyn turned a page. "There is one final personal inheritance," she said. The room became quiet. Caleb Mercer is to receive the 2011 Ford Explorer, currently registered in the estate. For several seconds, nobody reacted. Then Julian laughed. "Wait," he said, looking around the room. "That's his inheritance." Martin lowered his eyes, but Caleb noticed the small smile on his father's face. Evelyn calmly nodded. "The vehicle is transferred to Caleb free and clear." Julian leaned back in his chair and laughed again. "Grandfather gave you a used SUV while he gave the rest of us millions." Caleb looked at the keys sitting on the table. Instead of feeling embarrassed, he slowly picked them up. "Maybe he had a reason," he said quietly. Nobody laughed after that. After the hearing, Caleb walked alone toward the parking garage, while relatives gathered around Julian and his new properties. He could hear fragments of their conversations behind him. Someone was discussing the value of a lakeside house. Someone else was already planning what to do with newly inherited company shares. Caleb kept walking. The old Explorer was parked in a far corner of the garage beneath a layer of dust. It was not beautiful, but it was solid. The paint was faded, one side had a small dent, and the seats showed years of use. Caleb unlocked the door and sat behind the wheel. For a moment, he simply stared at the dashboard. "What were you trying to tell me, Grandpa?" he whispered. Everett had always been mysterious, but Caleb remembered one thing about him. The old man rarely did anything without a reason. Before Caleb could start the engine, his phone rang. It was Evelyn. "Caleb, there is something you need to remember," she said. "What is it?" "Your grandfather left a specific instruction regarding the vehicle." Caleb frowned. "What kind of instruction?" Evelyn paused. "Nothing inside the Explorer is to be removed, discarded, repaired, or examined by anyone except you until you have spoken to me again." Caleb looked around the vehicle. "Why?" "I can't explain that yet." "Does my father know?" Another pause followed. "Your father knows there was an instruction. He does not know everything." That answer immediately made Caleb uneasy. He ended the call and began inspecting the Explorer. The glove compartment contained ordinary documents. The center console held old coins, a tire gauge, and a faded receipt. Beneath the driver's seat, he found nothing. He checked the trunk and spare tire compartment. Nothing seemed unusual. Then he turned on the navigation system. The screen flickered before displaying one saved destination. Caleb stared at it. It did not show an address. It simply said home. "That's strange," he whispered. He pressed the destination button. A route appeared, leading west toward the Appalachian foothills, nearly 3 hours away. Caleb almost turned the system off. Then he remembered Evelyn's warning. If Everett had deliberately left the destination there, Perhaps the old explorer was not really an inheritance at all. Perhaps it was an invitation. Caleb started the engine and followed the route. The city disappeared slowly behind him. Tall buildings became shopping centers became farmland, and eventually the roads narrowed into long stretches of forest. Caleb drove for almost 3 hours without knowing what waited at the end of the route. Several times he considered turning around. His father had already sent 2 messages asking where he was. Julian had also called twice. Caleb ignored both of them. The farther he traveled, the more certain he became that his grandfather had planned this carefully. Near sunset, the navigation system directed him onto a steep mountain road. The pavement eventually disappeared, replaced by gravel. At the end of the road stood an old wooden railing overlooking a wide valley. Caleb switched off the engine. The silence was almost unsettling. Then he noticed an elderly man standing beside a battered pickup truck. The man wore a faded denim jacket, worn boots, and a brown hat. He looked directly at Caleb as if he had been expecting him. Caleb lowered the window. "Can I help you?" The old man walked closer. "You're Caleb Mercer." Caleb immediately became alert. "How do you know my name?" The man studied his face for a moment before answering. "Your grandfather told me you would come." Caleb stepped out of the Explorer. "Who are you?" "My name is Gideon Reed." He extended his hand. Caleb shook it. Gideon's grip was surprisingly strong. "Did Everett leave you the vehicle?" he asked. "Yes." Gideon smiled faintly. Then he kept his promise. Caleb stared at him. "What promise?" Gideon looked toward the mountains. "He told me that one day his family would laugh when you received that car." Caleb felt a strange chill. He knew. He knew almost everything. Caleb looked back at the Explorer. "Why did he give me a used car?" Gideon walked toward the rear of the vehicle. "Because the car was never the inheritance." He stopped and looked over his shoulder. It was the message. Caleb followed him. Gideon crouched beside the cargo floor and pulled back the carpet. Hidden underneath was a tiny metal latch Caleb had never noticed. "Your grandfather asked me to help him put this here," Gideon said. Caleb opened the compartment and found a small black metal box. "What is inside?" Gideon looked at him seriously. "The reason Everett didn't trust your father." Caleb froze. "My father?" Gideon nodded. "And if you are willing to hear the truth, Caleb, your life is about to become very different." Caleb stared at the black box for several seconds before looking at Gideon. "You expect me to believe that my grandfather hid evidence inside an old car and sent me 3 hours into the mountains to find you?" Gideon gave a small smile. "No, I expect you to believe your grandfather knew his family better than you did." Caleb looked down at the box. "Then why didn't he tell me himself?" Gideon's expression softened. "Because dead men cannot protect the people they love. Everett believed that if he told you too much while he was alive, someone might discover what he was doing." Caleb slowly opened the box. Inside were an old photograph, a folded property document, a handwritten letter, and a sealed envelope carrying his name. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably Everett's. "Caleb, if you are reading this, then everyone believes I left you almost nothing." Caleb swallowed hard and continued reading. "That is exactly what I wanted them to believe." He looked at Gideon. What was he afraid of? Gideon answered quietly, "Greed." The letter explained that Everett had spent his final years watching his family change. People who once visited him because they loved him had begun visiting because they wanted something. He had also discovered unexplained payments leaving his company through consulting firms that appeared legitimate on paper. Millions had disappeared. Everett had ordered a private investigation and had secretly hired forensic accountants. Caleb's breathing became heavier as he read. Then he reached a sentence that made him stop. "I believe someone close to me is helping move money from the company." Caleb looked up. Was it my father? Gideon didn't answer. Caleb returned to the letter. Everett wrote that Martin had become obsessed with protecting his position inside the family empire. Julian had become obsessed with proving that he deserved the life his grandfather had built. But Caleb had remained outside the business. You are the only one who never asked me what you would inherit, Everett wrote. That is why I trust you. Caleb felt his eyes burn. He had spent years believing his grandfather preferred Julian. Yet now he understood that Everett had been watching him differently. The sealed envelope contained a final instruction. Do not confront Martin. Do not tell Julian what you find. Take the property document to Evelyn Hart and ask her about the Mercer family trust. Caleb looked at Gideon. There is a trust? Gideon nodded. There is something else, too. Caleb waited. Your grandfather did not leave you his wealth because he wanted you to become rich. He left it because he wanted to see what kind of man you would become when you discovered how much power you had. Caleb drove home after dark with the black box hidden beneath the spare tire. The entire journey felt different from the drive into the mountains. Earlier, he had been curious. Now he was frightened. His grandfather's letter had turned a disappointing inheritance into something far more dangerous. When Caleb finally reached his neighborhood, he immediately noticed a black sedan parked across from his house. His father was standing beside it. Martin Mercer had always carried himself like a man who believed every room belonged to him. Even now, under the yellow streetlight, he looked perfectly controlled. Caleb stopped the Explorer and stepped out. Martin glanced at the vehicle before looking at his son. Where have you been? Driving. For 3 hours? Caleb shrugged. The car had a saved destination. Martin's expression changed for only a second, but Caleb noticed it. Where did it take you? The mountains. Martin walked closer. Why? I wanted to see where my grandfather used to spend time. His father studied him carefully. Caleb, your grandfather was not well near the end. Maybe. He was suspicious of everyone. Caleb folded his arms. Including you? Martin became silent. That silence told Caleb more than an answer would have. What did you find? Martin finally asked. Nothing. Don't lie to me. Caleb looked directly into his father's eyes. Why are you worried? Martin's voice dropped. Because some things are better left alone. Like what? Like whatever your grandfather thought he was protecting. Caleb felt his heart pound, but he kept his face calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Martin stepped closer. Caleb, listen to me. Take the car, sell it, and forget this happened. You received something. Your grandfather made his choice. You should make yours. Caleb almost laughed. Is that what you told yourself? His father's face hardened. You have no idea what you're asking. Then explain it. Martin looked toward the house. Not here. Why not? Because you don't know who might be listening. That sentence changed everything. Martin walked back to the sedan, but before getting inside, he turned around. Your grandfather spent his whole life building this family. Don't let his final mistake destroy it. Caleb watched the car disappear down the street. He then entered his house, locked every door, and placed the black box on the kitchen table. For the first time, he understood that the inheritance hearing had not been the beginning of the story. It had been the trapdoor opening beneath his feet. And somewhere behind the millions his family had received, there was a secret Everett had trusted Caleb to uncover. Caleb did not open the black box again that night. He sat at his kitchen table until nearly 2 a.m, staring at the documents while the sound of the refrigerator filled the quiet house. His father's warning kept replaying in his mind. You don't know who might be listening. Caleb had never thought of his father as a dangerous man. Martin had always been strict, proud, and emotionally distant, but never openly threatening. Yet the moment Martin saw the explorer, something in his face had changed. Caleb finally reached for his phone and called Evelyn Hart. She answered after the 3rd ring. Caleb. I need to see you tomorrow. Evelyn was silent for a moment. Did you find the box? Caleb looked toward the table. How did you know there was a box? Because Everett told me there would be. Caleb leaned back. Then you knew all along. I knew enough to understand that your grandfather wanted you to discover the truth yourself. What truth? Evelyn lowered her voice. Not over the phone. The next morning, Caleb drove to her office. Evelyn closed the blinds before placing a thick brown folder in front of him. Your grandfather established the Mercer Family Trust 8 years ago, she explained. Caleb opened the folder. Why wasn't it mentioned at the hearing? Because the trust was designed to remain separate from the public inheritance. How much is inside it? Evelyn looked directly at him. Enough to make your other relatives very interested if they discover it. Caleb frowned. How much? The current estimated value is more than $70 million. Caleb stared at her. 70 million. Evelyn nodded. But you cannot simply take the money. She pointed to several conditions. Caleb had to remain independent from the family company. He could not transfer control to his father or brother. He also had to appoint an independent trustee if a family conflict arose. Why would Grandpa put all these conditions on me? Caleb asked. Evelyn smiled sadly. Because he wasn't protecting the money from you, Caleb. He was protecting you from the money. Caleb looked down at the folder. And the financial investigation. Evelyn opened another file. That is where things become serious. She showed him a list of consulting companies. Your grandfather suspected that company funds were being diverted. Caleb recognized one name immediately. It belonged to one of his father's closest advisors. How much? He asked. Evelyn hesitated. We have confirmed approximately $18 million in suspicious transfers. Caleb slowly closed the folder. My father did this? Evelyn answered carefully. We have evidence connecting people close to him. We are still building the complete picture. Caleb stood. Then build it. I don't want revenge. I want the truth. Evelyn nodded. That is exactly what your grandfather hoped you would say. For the next 3 weeks, Caleb lived 2 completely different lives. During the day, he went to work, repaired equipment, paid his bills, and behaved as though nothing had changed. At night, he worked with Evelyn and an independent forensic accounting team to follow the money Everett had suspected was disappearing from his company. The deeper they looked, the worse the picture became. Payments had been divided into smaller amounts and sent through consulting companies that appeared legitimate but had almost no real business activity. Some invoices described meetings that had never happened. Others listed vague services that nobody could explain. One afternoon, the accountant placed a document in front of Caleb. This is the transaction that connects everything, she said. Caleb studied it. A large payment had been made shortly before Everett became seriously ill. The recipient company was controlled through a chain of businesses that eventually led to an account connected to Julian. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. My brother. Indirectly, the accountant replied, but the connection is strong. Caleb closed his eyes. He remembered Julian laughing in the conference room. Grandfather gave you a used SUV while he gave the rest of us millions. At that moment, his phone rang. It was Julian. Caleb answered. What do you want? Julian sounded calm. We need to talk. About what? About Grandpa. Caleb said nothing. Julian continued. I know you've been meeting with Evelyn. Caleb looked at the documents on his desk. Who told you? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Julian sighed. Caleb listened carefully. Dad can make this disappear. Make what disappear? The investigation. Caleb leaned back. And what would I have to do? Julian paused. Walk away. Caleb almost laughed. That's all. You'll receive $5 million. Silence filled the line. $5 million. Caleb asked. Yes. And I forget everything. You stop cooperating with the accountants. You keep the trust, if that's what Grandpa left you, and everyone moves forward. Caleb shook his head. You don't understand. Julian's voice hardened. Then help me understand. Caleb looked at Everett's photograph, sitting beside the computer. My grandfather spent his life building that company. If someone stole from it, I can't pretend it didn't happen. Julian became quiet. Then he said something Caleb would remember forever. You really think Grandpa was innocent? Caleb's expression changed. What does that mean? Ask yourself why he kept secrets from everyone. Maybe because he knew he couldn't trust everyone. Julian gave a bitter laugh. You think you're different from us? No, Caleb replied. I think I have a choice. Julian's voice became cold. Then choose carefully. Once this becomes public, the Mercer family will never be the same. Caleb looked at the financial records. Maybe it shouldn't be. He ended the call and immediately contacted Evelyn. Start the formal audit. Evelyn paused. Are you certain? Caleb answered, yes. Whatever happens next, I want it to be based on facts, not fear. The audit became public 2 months later, and the Mercer family quickly learned that money could not protect anyone from consequences. The board suspended several executives, banks demanded explanations, and lawyers began reviewing years of financial records. Martin stopped answering family calls. Julian disappeared from public view. Relatives who had laughed at Caleb during the inheritance hearing suddenly began calling him. One cousin apologized for the way she had treated him. An uncle asked whether his inheritance was safe. Another relative wanted to know whether Caleb could speak to the board on his behalf. Caleb listened to every request, but refused them all. I don't control what happens to you, he told one uncle. Then who does? The man demanded. Caleb answered quietly, the truth does. One evening, Julian appeared outside Caleb's house. He no longer wore expensive suits. He stood beneath the porch light in an ordinary jacket, looking exhausted. Caleb opened the door, but stayed inside. Why are you here? Julian swallowed. I need to tell you something. Caleb waited. Julian looked down. Dad knew. Caleb's expression remained still. Knew what? He knew money was being moved. And you? Julian hesitated. I knew some of it. Caleb felt a deep sadness rather than anger. How much did you take? Julian looked away. Enough. That's not an answer. Julian finally looked at him. I made choices I thought everyone else was making. Caleb shook his head. You laughed at me because you thought I was the loser. Julian's eyes became wet. I know. You thought I was worthless because I didn't care about the family money. I know. Then why are you here? Julian took a long breath. Because Grandpa was right about you. Caleb frowned. What did he say? He said you were the only person in the family who could be trusted with power because you didn't spend your life trying to prove you deserved it. Caleb looked away. Julian continued. I hated hearing that when I was younger. I thought he was insulting me. Now I understand. Caleb opened the door wider, but did not invite him inside. What happens now? Julian asked. Caleb answered honestly. I don't know. Julian nodded. I don't expect you to forgive me. Caleb looked at his brother. I don't know if I can. That's fair. Julian turned to leave, then stopped. But I'm going to cooperate with the investigation. Caleb nodded. Good. After Julian left, Caleb stood alone on the porch. He had once dreamed of seeing his brother humbled. Yet now that it had happened, there was no joy in it. There was only the realization that greed had damaged every person it touched, including the people who thought they were winning. The final report confirmed that millions had been diverted from the Mercer Company over several years. Martin had approved suspicious payments, Julian had benefited from some of the money, and several executives had helped hide the transactions. Legal proceedings followed, and the family empire that Everett had built began changing under new leadership. Martin eventually came to Caleb's house without lawyers, assistants, or excuses. He stood on the porch for almost a minute before speaking. "Can I come in?" Caleb nodded. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Martin looked older than Caleb had ever seen him. "I knew your grandfather was investigating us," he said. Caleb waited. "I thought I could fix everything before he discovered the full truth." "Why?" Martin looked down at his hands. "Fear." Caleb frowned. "Fear of what?" "Of never being enough." Martin explained that he had spent his entire life being compared to Everett. Every success belonged to his father in the eyes of the public. Every mistake belonged to him. When Julian became interested in money, Martin pushed him toward wealth because he believed financial success would finally make the family respect them. "I taught him the wrong lesson," Martin said. "I taught him that money was proof of worth." Caleb stared at him. "And what did you teach me?" Martin's eyes filled with regret. "I taught you that you didn't matter." The words hit Caleb harder than he expected. Martin continued. "You were always different. You liked fixing things. You never cared about expensive cars or business deals. Your grandfather admired that. I was jealous." Caleb looked away. "You were jealous of your own son." "Yes." Martin's voice cracked. "Because I thought your grandfather respected you more than he respected me." Caleb sat quietly. For years, he had believed his father simply didn't notice him. Now he understood that Martin had noticed everything and had allowed insecurity to turn into cruelty. "What happens now?" Caleb asked. Martin answered, "I face the consequences. And if I can't forgive you, then I accept that." Caleb nodded. "Good." Martin looked surprised. "Good. Because forgiveness isn't something you can demand." Martin lowered his head. "I know." Before leaving, he stopped at the door. "Caleb, your grandfather was right about one thing." "What?" "You became the man I should have been." Caleb watched his father walk away. Later that evening, Evelyn called with one final document from Everett's trust. It revealed that the $70 million trust was only part of Caleb's inheritance. Everett had created a charitable foundation under Caleb's control, dedicated to helping veterans, working families, students, and people facing sudden financial emergencies. Caleb read the document twice. He finally understood the purpose behind everything. Everett had not wanted Caleb to become the richest member of the family. He wanted him to become the person who understood what wealth was supposed to do. Several months later, Caleb returned to the mountain overlook where everything had begun. The old explorer climbed the winding road slowly, its engine making the same familiar sound it had made on the first journey. Caleb parked beside Gideon's battered pickup and stepped out. Gideon was sitting on the hood with a cup of coffee in his hands. "You came back," he said. Caleb smiled. "I needed to." Gideon handed him another cup. "How is your family?" Caleb looked toward the valley. "Different." "And you?" Caleb thought for a moment. "Different too." He told Gideon about the investigation, his father's confession, Julian's apology, and the charitable trust. Gideon listened without interrupting. When Caleb finished, the old man smiled. Everett would have been proud. Caleb shook his head. "I thought he gave me the worst inheritance." Gideon laughed softly. "That was the point." Caleb looked at the explorer. "Everyone thought I had lost. But you hadn't." Caleb nodded. He finally understood why Everett had chosen an old vehicle instead of a fortune that everyone could see. The car had taken him away from the family long enough to hear the truth. It had taken him to Gideon. It had taken him to the hidden documents. Most importantly, it had forced him to discover what kind of person he wanted to become. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the brass key. He turned it over in his hand before placing it on the dashboard. Then he started the Explorer. The navigation system still displayed the same saved destination. Home. Caleb smiled. He realized that Everett had been speaking to him long before the inheritance hearing. Home was not the mansion. It was not the family name. It was not the bank account. Home was the place where a person no longer needed to prove that he deserved to exist. Caleb drove away from the overlook with the windows slightly open and the mountain air filling the vehicle. He knew his family would never be the same. Some relationships would take years to heal. Some might never heal completely. But he had decided that he would not carry bitterness into the rest of his life. The greatest victory was not watching Martin face consequences. It was not seeing Julian admit that he had been wrong. It was not proving that the supposedly worthless grandson had actually inherited millions. The greatest victory was refusing to become like the people who had hurt him. Everett had left behind money, companies, properties, and investments. But Caleb believed his real inheritance was something far more valuable: wisdom, responsibility, courage, and compassion. The old explorer had looked worthless in that conference room, yet it had carried Caleb toward the truth and given him a purpose that money alone could never provide. Sometimes the greatest gift in life arrives disguised as disappointment. Sometimes being underestimated gives a person the freedom to become something greater. And sometimes the inheritance that changes a life is not the fortune written in a will, but the lesson hidden inside the thing everyone else believed was worthless. Caleb finally understood his grandfather's final message. Wealth is not measured by what a person keeps, but by what that person chooses to do with what he has. And as the explorer disappeared down the mountain road, Caleb knew he had finally found the inheritance Everett had wanted him to have all along. Like and subscribe to my channel for more contents like this, and let us know where you are watching from under the comment section.